Okay, so the first discussion, we're talking about you are going to a job interview or an interview for a new job. In order to prepare for the job, you're asking your friend for advice. The friend then prompts you what makes you stand out from a crowd. If you're thinking about attention in a cognitive sense, what does it really mean to stand out from a crowd? And what are 3 things that could make you stand out from a crowd? All right, so who's got an answer to this prompt? Anybody think of something interesting? Over here, did you raise your hand? I'm picking on you anyway.
We said personality makes you stand out the most.
Personality?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know what kind of thing about a personality draws attention in, maybe?
I mean, if you can entertain someone, then that makes you more memorable after you leave the
Memorable.
interview. Yeah.
Okay, so that's great. Attention depending on memory as well, or
Yeah.
connected. That's good. Anything else? Anyone? Mm-hmm.
Well, I said confidence because if you're sitting up straight and you're confident that you already have the job, like it's yours, they're more likely to remember that you were so strong-willed.
Mm-hmm. So your confidence creates the image of you, and that's something that can be picked up on,
Yeah.
attended to. Nice, nice. Awesome. We got some volunteer over here. Mm-hmm.
Well, if you kind of think of it not in a stand out like in a good way, if you want to not stand out or stand out kind of in a negative way, like be a slump, like not look good, like people remember you not necessarily in a good way, but they'll remember you.
That's a great point. That's an interesting take on the prompt, standing out in a negative sense. I like it. Anybody else? Anything creative? Mm-hmm.
You have to be personable.
Personable? Okay. So that's capturing.
Capture their attention in a friendly way.
In a
Make sure
friendly
that they're.
Yeah, so it's memorable again,
Right.
right? That these good qualities standing out. Okay, I like it. You could also wear bright colors, for instance, so that saliency, you really pop on a screen, that kind of thing. Cool. Well, hopefully this will stimulate your thinking a little bit more just with the rest of today. Click this thing back on. Okay, so I just want to talk about a couple things before we get started. Remember that your paper is coming up. So here's just a little bit more written down about what you should be thinking about for your paper. So this is a summary of a scientific paper. You're going to summarize and critique a journal article. So you're going to choose one article from any kind of cognitive psychology journal. It has to be peer-reviewed. Come on in. Hi. Any kind of peer-reviewed journal article. So a lot of this could be achieved by searching the library, the GMU library site. And then you're going to run that by me. So it can be any topic that you're interested in. It just has to be cognitively based in a peer-reviewed journal. That means no New Yorker, that type of thing, even though it might be fun. And you could look at the New Yorker and then find a link to a scientific article if you were so inclined. The paper will be 5 to 10 pages, double-spaced. So it might sound like a lot, but really when you get started writing, this is not a huge deal. So it's 2.5 to 5 pages. But take it seriously, please. So in the paper, you're going to identify these 3 things. What is the research question that's being addressed? What are the methods that are being used in this article, in the study? And then just talk about their results and their conclusions throughout that they arrived at in the paper. So that's what's actually interesting about it. So the evaluation of the paper and statement of importance, basically, of the work that they're doing. You need to make sure that you're clearing each article with me, so you need to have the approval of the article, so that's the due date coming up March 1st. So find your paper, whatever it is, find a few different papers and kind of figure out what you're most interested in, because it'll be a big pain in your butt to write a paper about something that ends up being crappy. So just take a little look, make sure that you're finding the right thing before you submit it to me last second. And something that you might want to, so you're going to turn in a copy of the article with your critique at the end. And then here's examples. You can find such a paper in cognition or psychological science. Again, just search the library website, and you can ask me one-on-one if you're having issues finding something, that kind of thing. So remember that the approval for that article is coming up March 1st. It's really the thing. And then I had a weird typo or a change in my syllabus that's, I guess, a little different than other people's syllabi, just that we have included this discussion section of the points. So if you read the syllabus, it said that each of the 3 exams, so if you're considering you're dropping one, that it was 28 points. So it's actually worth 25 points. So the total of all of your exams is worth 75% of your grade. So I know that the exam that you just took was 28, but just think of it, it'll be converted so that those 28 points are worth 25% of your total grade. So just don't worry too much about it. Just remember that your total exam points is 75. And while we're on that topic, how are we doing with the exam? How many people have taken it already? Good number, okay. So some of you still need to. That's just fine. You have until midnight on Friday. At that point, after everybody's taken the exam, so I think it'll be on Saturday, the system will automatically let everybody see what your actual answers are. So you can see what your score is right after you take it, but you can't see the actual answers. That's intentional so that anybody who hasn't taken it yet doesn't have access to somebody's completed answers, which makes sense, right? But might be a little different just because we're taking it online. So, yeah. Any questions, anything specifically I've gotten?
You're still dropping the lowest test grade, right?
Yes. Yep. Your lowest is dropped. So far, the syllabus states you can't miss your final exam. So that's the very last thing. If you missed your final exam, then it would still count as a 0, and then all 4 would be counted. That's something that's a policy that was implemented before me. We'll take a look at that at the end because they're all online. I don't particularly care. But just take note if there are any questions that you don't like. I mean, obviously, you'll be able to see these afterwards, and I'll run statistics and just make sure if anything really did seem misleading, then we'll take a look. I don't know yet if there's going to be a curve, anything like that. So we'll just proceed as we do. I'm going to check really quick, make sure it's recording. Okay. Okay, so today we're talking about chapter 4 in your book, which is attention. Which is a funny little picture of a polar bear not paying attention to the sign that says watch for ice. Obviously a polar bear wouldn't, but it's kind of cute. Might remind you of, did anybody slip and fall on the ice these past few days? Yeah, got one. I definitely did. Just make sure that, you're being safe as we have this funny weather coming up. And drive safe too. It's my warning, whatever, to all of you. Okay, so your introduction, this is the beginning of the chapter. So Sam is driving down the street towards his goal. His goal is lunch date with his friend Susan. He thinks about his meeting with Susan. He's also listening to a talk show on the radio, but he isn't thinking much about the driving process itself. However, just as he's passing a movie theater, something startling appears. It's a ball that's approaching his car, going across the street, and then shortly after, a small boy is chasing the ball. So his part of an automatic system takes over, and he glances quickly left. He sees that the lane is open. He swerves, hits the brakes in an attempt to avoid the boy, and is successful in this thing. So it's a very quick process. Even though he wasn't thinking too much about driving, he was able to successfully not kill the child, thankfully. So today we're talking about what is attention. So attention is this process of concentrating on specific features of the environment. So we're all intaking all of our sensory information, but we're able to concentrate on the important parts to be able to synthesize our eventual response to these parts. So we focus on these specific features that leads to an exclusion of all of the other sensory information that's not very important. This has a large effect on what we're actually aware of. There are things that are occurring that we're not aware of, and it's important to be aware that you're not aware of certain things as well. So it makes us focus on things, and that leads to the exclusion of other things. So we have two different things, like facets of attention. It can be selective for one feature, or it can be a divided attention, so you're paying attention to multiple features at the same time. And attention has an effect on other cognitive functions. Specifically, or most notably, it has an effect on our perception. So if you remember from the perception lecture, paying attention to things will increase the chances that you're paying, or that you're actually finally perceiving them. Like, think of that Sphinx picture back and forth. There's those like fun things that are in like comic strips, like what's different? Find the 7 things that are different in this scene versus this scene. If you're not paying attention to certain areas of the map or those features, it's hard to see them. So when you're scanning that, you're paying attention to what specifically might be different. So just think of that. So your perception of something is very much influenced by how much attention you're paying there. Like we said a little bit, the job interview scenario, our memory is affected by our attention to things. So if you're seeing the candidate on the job and they seem to you as if they have their stuff together, they're sitting up straight, they seem engaged, that's going to affect your memory of that person. Or if they tell a funny joke, or if they're late, for instance, those are elements that are going to capture your attention and change your memory based off of that. Reading cannot occur without paying attention to the letters and the words themselves, so attention will affect language, and then problem solving. Kind of obvious. If you are perceiving things or paying attention to different things, it eventually helps you know what to do with those elements. So the main questions kind of in science and dealing with attention, can we focus our attention on just one thing when you're perceiving all kinds of things, bringing in information from all of your senses? Can you pay attention to just one of them, select it? How do you deal with this distracting information, so things coming in, capturing your attention when you don't necessarily want them to? Can we focus our attention on more than one thing at a time? So if we can select one thing from all of the crowd and think about it, can we do that for more than one thing at a time? How is attention involved in this idea of multitasking? Multitasking is an interesting cognitive topic. There are people that say that we can never actually multitask, that it's actually attention switching or task switching. So you're quickly switching back and forth between the things that you're paying attention to, the tasks that you're completing, rather than doing both of them in a parallel way throughout your mind, which is kind of interesting. There's a lot of research to be done there, if any of you want to do grad school. So what is the difference between selective and divided attention? So selective attention. There's this task, we talked about it a little bit in the history of cognitive psychology. So this dichotic listening task, you're presented with 2 different messages, one in each ear, the listening part, and then the participant is instructed to pay attention to only one side, so pay attention to your right ear, for instance, or in this picture, what's left ear. And to monitor if the participant's actually doing this, they use the shadowing technique. Shadowing is just, you hear this message and then you verbally repeat the message that you heard. And so the result of this study is that you are able to select that one message, and you are able to fairly easily repeat what's happening in one ear. But when asked what's happening in the other ear, do you remember the message that you weren't paying attention to? Very little of that information was actually remembered or brought in. So they were able to distinguish between some characteristics, like if it was a male or female voice, that type of thing, but they really were unaware of the message. So it tells you that when we're paying attention to one thing, not a whole lot of information is actually being brought in and thought about with the rest of our mind. So it's an interesting phenomena that when you're paying attention to one thing, maybe you're unaware of a lot of the other things that are going on, and that we have this limited capacity of what we're paying attention to. So this kind of leads to this cocktail party effect, cocktail party phenomena. If you take social psych, some of you I saw on my social psych kind of remember this concept, which is basically that you're able to pay attention to one thing that's going on at a time. Where it's a noisy room, you're able to distinguish between the messages that you're trying to listen to versus all of the other messages that are going on at a time. And then we'll talk about the pop-up of if you're hearing your name. This causes an interesting phenomena in relation to this. You'll see in a second. But really consider that you're able to, when you have a noisy environment, there are a lot of different things going on. Language is something that we are able to pay attention to one message, at least fairly well, and filter out a lot of the other junk, but the other junk that we're filtering out, we're not gaining much information from that. So this led to a model, a cognitive model, Broadbent. So it's this idea that this is how selective attention is achieved. So on the far left, you see messages coming in into our minds. So from our sensory information, it's now being contained sort of in our working memory, our short-term memory. So you get all of the messages coming in that's held for a small amount of time. We're able to figure out what we're going to pay attention to, fed through some kind of a filter of what you're going to actually attend to from all of the sensory information coming in. So from that filter, only a small amount is coming out that leads to a detector, which allows you to actually perceive whatever message is going on, leads to memory itself. So the sensory information, or the sensory memory, holds all the information, or the incoming information, for a fraction of a second. So it's kind of this idea that we can take it all in, we need to figure out what to do with it quick, but there's a lot more stuff coming in all the time. So we have a limited capacity for the ability to store for a long time that sensory information. There's the filter that identifies the message that we're going to attend, the attended message, based on physical characteristics of that message, the sound of the voice, if it's male, female, what's kind of going on, that kind of thing. So we are distinguishing between all the stuff coming in, and the sound property itself is going to have physical characteristics. It's a waveform, and I don't know if you've ever played around with like audio processing software, you kind of get a better idea for it. So like what bands of frequency are you pulling in? For instance, like female voices are higher pitched, so that's something that you can distinguish. That's a physical characteristic that your mind can distinguish between, if that helps. So this detector is determining higher level characteristics of the message itself, the language that's that you're processing and you're paying attention to. So what words are you actually hearing from that? And how are you supposed to respond to those words? And then this is brought to eventually your short-term memory, I should correct. I think I said before the sensory memory. Anyway, This is kind of that final step of the model. So the short-term memory holds the information for 10 to 15 seconds, and this is sort of the process if you remember the other models or some of the other models. I'll let you on your own take a look at that and see how it fits in. But essentially you have that short-term memory unit or block in the model. Think about it as being able to hold a limited amount of actual messages for 10 to 15 seconds and then have an interplay with your long-term memory leading to eventually your decision making. So this is, think of this as a filter, what might be happening with this filter. Who's ever played with sieves? Do you know what I mean? Sieves? So it's like a mesh grating in a box or some kind of a container. So basically you take in things with fine particulate like sand, and then with this mesh layer, anything that's larger than the little holes that are in the mesh won't fall through. So you get this grating. You can take out things that are of a different physical property. So things that are larger are removed from the whole rest of the body of the sand. So in this way, this is just a conceptualization of that early stage in the selective attention model. So the filtering occurs before the information is analyzed, the analysis leading to the determination of the meaning. And think about it as physical properties as well, so the characteristics of the sound waveform that your mind is hearing. So this is an experiment trying to deal with this dichotic listening stuff. So the participant was presented with 2 letters in each ear at a time. So you hear on your, what is this, her right, why am I having such a problem with this right now? On her right side, she's hearing an M, and on her left side, she's hearing an H at the same time. So the total message is MH. And they're presented with this string of letters, so 6, so 3 different pairs occurring, and you're asked to repeat the letters after they are presented to you. So in condition 1, you're just allowed to state what letters you're hearing in any order you prefer. And in condition 2, you are asked to present them in the pairs that you were presented with. So the result is that in condition 1, people, let's see, to repeat each pair is presented. So basically, if you're told to, you can do whatever you want in the scenario, what people's preference is to say everything that came from one ear and then everything that came from the other ear. And when you're asked to repeat them at the same time, basically it's a little more difficult. They were able to do this reasonably so. There was definitely some difficulty because of the message filter. But the takeaway from this is that each side of the ear is getting information, and this isn't pooled into one attentional, I guess, resource slot. It's basically that you have one side is one message, the other side is another message. It's difficult to switch between these messages. It requires effort. So, which supports kind of this idea that if you're paying attention to one ear at a time, you're not hearing much of the other ear. So it's basically that there's different channels. I think that's all I want to say. Yeah, so condition 2, participants have to report what they're hearing in the pairs as they progress. So you'd have to report the W and the P. So it is, in this one, it's, you can see, let's see. Sorry, I'm reporting this in a bad fashion, but so in the first experiment, when they're allowed to do whatever they want, they report one ear, all of the three things, and then the other ear all of the three things. And they were able to report at 65% accuracy. And then in the second task, they were only able to report at a 20%, or 20% of the words correctly. So they were required to switch between the channels, and it affected their overall performance. So kind of think about that. Hopefully hopefully that helps you kind of conceptually think about this idea. In another experiment, this is sort of a verbal Stroop or a listening Stroop task. We'll get to the Stroop in a minute. This is kind of interesting. So it's this idea that since we can only listen to, since it's easier to distinguish between the two channels and you think about one at a time, participants were asked to only listen to a message coming from one ear. In that ear, they heard, Dear 7 Jane. In the other ear, they heard 9 Aunt 6. So in the presentation, trial 1, trial 2, trial 3, on one ear you would have, or in both channels, so switching between, you hear 9, 7, 6, and Dear Aunt Jane, but switched in between, so think of it kind of like that. Without knowing what they were doing, participants reported that they heard Dear Aunt Jane, and they were unaware of what was going on in the other ear. But that kind of shows that even though it was difficult to switch between the two channels, they automatically were able to do so, and they were unaware that they were doing so. So that suggests kind of an interesting addition to sort of this filter idea, that there's some effect of the meaning behind the actual messages themselves, that there's something there that even though it's difficult for our minds to distinguish between those messages, there's some part of us that finds that useful enough that we will automatically do that. So Treisman, we talked a little, or she had work that was highlighted in your book before. In 1964, she basically suggested that there's this other stage and decided to put it in that model. So it's an attenuator. So we have the beginning, the message comes into a new unit, this attenuator idea. So the attenuator will distinguish between this message that we're only paying attention to, so the attended message, and then a little bit of what we're not paying attention to will still be able to, we'll still remember a little bit of that. So not a whole lot, but we'll get a little bit of that signal, which we can eventually possibly use later. So the information that we're paying attention to comes in, and then we can distinguish between these dictionary units, and a little bit that we're unaware of is still coming through to this dictionary unit, leading to memory. So most of the time this is nothing, but if you consider it in the context of the cocktail effect, basically you're distinguishing between all of the outlying information, so all of the noise that's going on and listening to your conversation partner, but across the room somebody says your name, and you're able to, while you're not consciously perceiving what else is going on, your mind is able to pick up on the fact that somebody talked about your name. The idea is basically that your name is highly salient, which means you are in particular sensitive to somebody saying your name, which makes sense because all of your life you're used to people calling you by your name. Maybe they're saying horrible things about you in a corner, or maybe they're saying nice things. The takeaway is that you, even though you're not consciously perceiving this, some part of you is able to use that useful information. So the experiment that was conducted, same thing as this kind of dichotic listening, but it's getting at the how much signal strength do you need to activator to actually consciously perceive that not attended message. Let me go back to this model. Maybe this will kind of help. So we're getting all of the messages from the cocktail party. It's fed into this attenuator unit. You're filtering out just about everything except you're getting this, so you've got the big line coming into the dictionary unit is that message you're hearing from your friend who you're talking to, and the little bit of stuff that's coming in is the extra signal that might be useful to you. So if your name is this extra signal, it's still likely that you're going to be able to pick up on it in that dictionary unit setting. Does that kind of help make sense?
Just go over what the dictionary unit means.
Yeah, dictionary unit is, I know what this word is. So Ava is my advisor's name. So Ava would be a dictionary unit. It's one word or a name. That was a good question. So then this experiment, basically how much signal, how loud or whatever does this message need to be for you to be able to pick up on it even though you're not consciously attending to that thing. So your own name, you don't need it to be very loud. For instance, you're still going to be able to pick up on it because we're biased towards our names. It's useful for us to. Whereas a word that we're not very used to, rutabaga, it's going to have to be pretty loud for you to actually consciously perceive that, and a little bit less for words that we interact with on a more regular fashion, but still, like your name would be the easiest for you to be able to pick up on. So basically you can distinguish between the words themselves. So the word would be the dictionary unit, and a word carries specific meaning to you. Like if somebody said fire, for instance, you're probably going to be able to pick up on that because it's important, it's salient. So this is a little bit more work kind of feeding into that idea of the attenuator. Where are we actually selecting what we're paying attention to? So that kind of idea of the unconscious message coming through. So in this experiment, participants were listening to, in one ear, an ambiguous message. So the ambiguous message was, they were throwing stones at the bank. So hearing that sentence, you're not entirely sure. It has two potential meanings, which is basically people were throwing rocks at a physical structure, the financial institution, a bank, or people were throwing stones at a river bank, just because bank has those two meanings. So in the other ear, they heard either money or they heard river. They were not able to explicitly say that that's what they heard, so they were unaware that they were hearing money or river in the ear that they're not attending to, but it still had an effect on what they later said the sentence meant. So they heard these two things, and then later they were asked, what does this mean? So they could pick either I was throwing, or they were throwing rocks at the financial institution, or they were throwing rocks at the riverbank. And so hearing money or river biased those responses in favor of the concepts that connected to each other. So it proposed an alternative route or an alternative model for what was at the time considered how we perceive or select these messages. So the first model, if you remember, things are filtered out based on just their physical characteristics. So that wave pattern, are you listening to a male or a female voice? And then eventually you find the meaning. But now we've got, when we're talking about this unattended message and the ability for that to make its way through the filter, we have a late selection model, so that's how you can distinguish between them. So this early selection model is just the physical characteristics. The late selection model proposes that there's something else that's coming through, not just the physical characteristics, but that potential for it to spawn the idea of the dictionary unit, so the meaning of the sounds that are coming through, that the sound waves, when I say Ava, my advisor knows that that's her name, so that is filtered through as well. So it's really a question then of what model is actually correct. And so how do you start to test those things? There's actually evidence for both of these models. But if there's evidence for both of these models, how do you use that model? A model is supposed to tell you, I have this input, I get this output. If you have two models that would say two different things, what does that mean? How do you correctly use those models to understand the cognition that's occurring? So then this idea was proposed that maybe something is biasing or changing what model is going to be used based on some property. The property ends up being task load, or how many of your cognitive resources are being used up at that point. So we have early selection and the late selection models. In a high task load, an example or so, it would be that a person's resources are being used up on that task. There's not a lot of potential to pay attention that's left over. So think of Samantha is practicing for her piano recital. She's working on a particularly difficult part of her piano song, music. So she's repeating that over and over. She's paying a lot of attention to it, is trying very hard to understand that. So in this process, there's not a lot of room for her to be distracted. So she maybe isn't noticing that somebody's playing with a ball in another room, that kind of thing. Whereas in a low task load, you do have the capacity to pay attention to other things. The example being Raghu is quickly scanning a celebrity gossip magazine that he has very little interest in, so he's just doing it for whatever reason. Since he's not that invested in the thing, it doesn't require a lot of his attention. He's easily distracted in this. So if somebody that he knows is walking into the room, then he's able to pay attention to that. How this is studied experimentally, we have this flanker task. So what you're supposed to be paying attention to is the square in the middle and then the square that appears within one of the circles, and completely independent of the task, there's a square that occurs just to the side of what you're supposed to be paying attention to. Either it occurs in the same orientation, so you can tell it's a square, or it occurs in a different position, so it's a diamond in that regard. So it's this is a fairly low load task itself, so it doesn't take a lot to be able to identify the different squares. And in the results, this congruent trial, it's your reaction time is less because it is totally congruent. There's not really a lot of thinking that you'd have to do, so it's a low load process. Even though you're not supposed to be paying attention to it, it indicates that some amount of you is paying attention if a simple difference in what you're not supposed to be paying attention to causes a difference in your reaction time to the actual task. So that's kind of the idea, is that you're comparing two things that are that shouldn't be biasing your performance on the task, because you're not supposed to be paying attention to these things. Yet a simple change does affect your reaction time. So whatever's going on is still biasing the task, which means that you're paying some attention to what's going on the side. In comparison, if you do the same task, but there's a little more demand for your attention, this is a higher load task, so you're distinguishing between all of the other different shapes when you're supposed to be paying attention to the square. So then when you have this distractor, this totally unimportant thing on the side, just the square and the diamond, then you're seeing that it's not actually biasing you. I think this is a non-significant change between them, but basically that you're not paying attention to this distractor component in this experimental setting. When the task is a little bit more difficult, which it's supposed to indicate that you're using all of your attention on just the task that you're supposed to be paying attention to when it's a little more demanding of you. And there's nothing left over for you to be able to pay attention to this distractor, this totally unimportant task. So here's just a summary again. So the task load influences whether the distractor is going to be processed or it's not going to be processed. If it's a low load task, then your other resources are available. It's going to change the eventual result. So it's changing your cognition if you are still using those available resources for something else. And in a high load task, you have no additional resources to spare on something else, so you're not going to be using those unexistent resources on something else. Does that make sense? Yes, no? Yes, okay. Okay, so interestingly, there is an effect on, or of what we call an individual difference. So some people are video game players, some people are not video game players. That would depend on the individual themselves. So that affects the task or the performance at the actual task. Individual differences are something that are really interesting in psychology. A lot of times it's sort of elusive. You have to figure out what these individual differences are. That you have this study and you think it's a great study and that you're actually going to find an effect, and then in the end it's a bunch of random data and you have no idea what you're looking at. It's possible that there's some individual difference that you're not accounting for. So in this case, you have that same task. In the low load and the high load conditions, you are seeing that difference in attentional, or the difference in reaction time that would indicate that you're using your additional attentional resources. So the idea behind this is that a video game player is an expert at a task, or more expert than your average person, that they're able to, that they find this task easy because they're used to distinguishing between characteristics in a noisy environment. So that indicates something else that's a little bit interesting, which we might get into in a divided attention. Basically that, so our minds use heuristics we talked about in kind of that perception, that idea that you learn things about the environment, you learn things about what you're going to be exposed to, and the idea that you're able to learn this information, the learned information or the learned process for that information makes your eventual life easier. That's a good thing. If you're learning something, you'd hope that it would benefit you in some way. And essentially, training on some specific thing can improve your performance with that. So an improved performance might result in the availability of more cognitive resources. So kind of that idea with driving that we discussed in the beginning, the original example. If somebody is an expert driver, they're used to driving, it'll be easier for them to notice things that are happening on the side of the road. So they've got that additional capacity for paying attention that helps them stop when there's somebody in the way. Yeah, here we go. So it gets into this idea of divided attention. Are you able to pay attention to more than one thing that's going on? So distribute that overall capacity to pay attention, and are you able to effectively apply that to a few different things? So practice and task difficulty determine the divided attention abilities. So again, if you're a highly trained video game player, that is a lower task load because it's just something you have a lot of training with. So it gets into this idea of driving, and I want to show you a short video. We all know that we're not supposed to text and drive, right? But a lot of people do it anyway. Why is that? People are stupid? Oh, totally. But here's something that people have done kind of at GMU. So this idea of can you truly divide your attention, especially when it's something like driving. It's very critical, it's very important that you're paying attention to everything at once, or everything in that task. But if you're using those attentional resources on something that's totally unimportant, like texting your friend, I'm on my way, or dude, something, then
drivers learn in real time.
You might cause an accident. And in fact, many people do. And that's a bad thing. So let's see if this plays through the sound system.
Consequences of distracted driving. Fairfax County Bureau Chief Gail Pettigoffer joins us live from McLean with how this works. Gail?
Well, it was interesting to see a certain group of students helping another certain group of students. It's all in that quest to help keep everyone safer on the road. Katie Manning never thought she'd...
Can you hear this? I know it's terrible quality. I'll just tell you the important parts. So I'm just going to mute it and then tell you. I did not. This is the only copy I could find of it. Basically, so GMU students took this driving simulator, so they used a simulator for driving, so you see a screen and it's showing your car and what you're doing, and in front of you there's a fake steering wheel, so you can control what's going on with your fake steering wheel, and this is used in a research setting, but it's kind of like a video game system, it's portable, so they took it to a local high school to basically demonstrate how easy it is to lose control of your car while you're texting. So it's all these kids in this assembly, and they're playing this thing and texting at the same time, and everybody fails. That's really the take-home message. Is they all think that they can do it. It's like, yeah, I'll play this game, I'll do this task, and they all fail, and they're like, wow, that was easier to fail than I initially thought it was. So it's kind of the idea that if you're doing research and you're coming up with conclusions that are important, especially for something like texting or driving, it can save lives, that you're able to do kind of public outreach, which in my opinion is a public service. It's a public good that you might be able to interfere with somebody's decisions to text and drive just by showing them, shocking them. They think they can do it, they obviously can't do it. That's new information.
Regular driving video games.
So I just wanted to show you guys that. This is kind of funny. What are you guys talking about? That's good. Talk.
I was saying that they don't have the swipe keyboards. And
Oh, yeah.
And she's saying that they don't have the voice-activated ones.
And I was saying,
It's definitely true.
The voice-activated one, God forbid you speak into it, and it chose the wrong word. And
Exactly.
you're freaking out trying to correct that.
Exactly.
Which defeats the whole purpose.
There was,
Recording, you know?
Yeah.
That's what happens to me all the time. That was me this
yeah. Don't text and drive.
So, what about, do you know of any experiments that they've done to repeated experiments at the proficiency point? What is it, 1,000 hours of a task? You become proficient and it becomes automatic?
It depends on the task, and we'll get into that in just a second. But absolutely, like there's some threshold per task that if you do it that many times, then you can become this expert.
Like the reason that you can get home and not know how you got home.
Yeah, exactly.
Because, driving is no longer like 15 different things. It's just one thing.
Yep. And you can even unconsciously do this thing, exactly. Like also if you've ever moved to a new place and then you just find yourself driving to the old place, it's because you're not consciously paying attention to it. You're able to do this and use very few of your attentional resources doing. So yeah, great point. And it's interesting in a cognitive or a physiological experimental way, you are actually, they've done these kinds of studies where they put somebody in an fMRI scanner, and the activation in your brain of a person beginning versus a person that's expert. So it's the exact same task, but you're looking at how much of your brain is working when you're doing this thing, and it shows that your mental workload or your actual activation does visibly decrease if you are an expert at whatever task. So I mean, it makes sense kind of if you're thinking about it in that sense, activation. If your brain is less active with something that you're, say, an expert at, there's more potential to be active in whatever other thing that you're paying attention to. Hopefully not texting while you're driving. There was actually, I had to go to a brown bag yesterday. I shouldn't say had to. I did have to, but it was interesting. Just about like the Federal Highway Commission. There's like swipe and there's like the voice activated stuff. And the idea is these companies want to make your life better, more fun. You're able to text and drive. That's totally safe. That would be great. We all want to live in a world where we don't actually have to drive. It's all self-driving. Our cars parallel park themselves. We can just be on the phone or watch a movie or whatever while we're driving. But the reality is we don't live in that kind of a world. The other reality is companies will make money off of telling you that you can live in that world, off of selling you the idea that this is the potential for you to have that new ability. So a lot of cars come with these features, like radar monitoring, adaptive cruise control. Who knows like adaptive cruise control? This is fun, futuristic stuff. It's like you don't even have to pay attention to your speed or anything. You can not even look and your car's gonna know how far away somebody is in front of you, and it'll automatically brake if they brake. So the idea is it's safer. If a driver does become distracted, the car itself will take over, so you can use less of your cognitive resources here. But the actual effect is people are way too trusting of that system and they do stupid things and then it leads to accidents anyway. So that's kind of the fun. So it's that sort of interplay with human and technology that if you're introducing human to super fun new technology and you're marketing it as if it's going to be easy and safe and all these things, a lot of people will immediately trust that, and that can lead to interesting problems. But back to sort of the lab setting. So there's this idea, or this is a study that was performed, consistent mapping. So you have the initial frame that's presented is memorize the numbers, these 4 numbers that are in this set. As the experiment continues, you're presented with a series of different frames for 20 frames, 20 frames per second. So it's like, yeah, if you have 60 frames per second. Okay, don't pay attention to that word. It's very fast. Just pay attention to they're presenting this this image to you very quickly. You're not really able to look at each of the quadrants and pay attention to that. It's flash for a second on the screen. So what you're able to find is at the beginning, so these things are flashed and you have to say within that trial if something that you're supposed to be remembering was actually presented on the screen in that trial. So it's kind of that learned idea. At first people are kind of crappy at the task, and then at 600 trials they start to become really good at the task and it becomes automatic. So it's the idea that you can learn something in 600 trials. That's not going to take too terribly long in an experimental setting. But essentially you can learn a task and then it becomes easier for you to complete the task later. There are going to be different effects on if you try this 5 months later, whatever. The important thing is that if you're presented with something over and over again, your brain will learn and you'll have to use less cognitive resources in performing that task. So this divided attention, when you get to the stage where you're automatically processing, that would be, I'm automatically knowing where I'm driving home to. I don't need to pay a lot of attention to that. I've learned it. It occurs with practice. It makes it possible for you to pay more attention to other things. So more than that just initial task. It occurs without your intention, so that it's happening unconsciously, that if it's happening unconsciously, you might make mistakes. Say you're not driving to your old home, you're driving to your new home, but you're not consciously thinking about it, so you're making a mistake.
So is that kind of similar to like muscle memory? So like say you're like a baseball player and you just pick up a ball and you know just to throw it, you don't even think about it, and your brain's kind of like the muscle and just like, okay, I'm driving home.
Absolutely. Or like playing an instrument, like you have that, I know this note makes, I have to make my hands this way. Initially, you're only able to play that note, look down, do whatever, but at an expert level, somebody can just glance at sheet music and just play. Because it's that ingrained that this image means this position. Yeah, exactly. That you're, that is a form of learning muscle memory. And once you have that very defined muscle memory, yeah, it makes the task automatic. So again, you're learning. This is leading to you being able to eventually put less of your cognitive resources into that. So this is an idea. This is a Stroop task. A lot of you might have seen this before. We're just going to go through it really quickly. It's this idea that we're all pretty much experts at reading at this point. So let's just read together, so red down to green right here. So if you start, so 1, 2, 3, red, orange, blue, orange, purple, green. Okay, now we're going to do the last column, but instead of telling me the words, you're going to call out the color itself. So ready? Purple, red, blue, orange, purple, green. Yeah. See, a little more difficult. So the idea is that reading the words has become so automatic to you. When you see a word, you are reading the word and not doing anything else with it. It's not a common mode to tell what the color of that word is so much as it is just to read it. So the process of reading has become so automatic that it's difficult for you to not read the words, so you make those mistakes. So coming back to the mapping task, so in the first trial, you're presented with something that you're supposed to remember. And then in the second task, you're presented with another letter. It's consciously presented to you, but you're not supposed to pay attention to that letter. You're supposed to pay attention to the one that you're told to pay attention to. So automatic processing becomes impossible as a task difficulty increases. So in this case, you're supposed to remember and distinguish between kind of these two letters. So in the initial case, it was easy for you to do that kind of thing, and you could learn it and become so good that you can automatically do this without devoting a lot of cognitive resources. But now the task has gotten more difficult, and it's not possible for you to perform that by memory or by learning. So here's again just an image of kind of this idea of the distractions while driving. So the risk of collision when using a cell phone is 4 times higher than when a cell phone is not being used, is just kind of the takeaway. So that's significantly more. If you're 4 times more likely, or you're at 4 times the risk of a collision when you're using a cell phone versus not, like that's a significant take home in your life. And for public safety. Basically that when you're driving, you still do need resources, even though certain things have become automatic. Where to go, you still need to process who's driving next to me, are they on their cell phone drifting into my lane, what's going on, and even just your visual needs. So there's different modes, basically. There's what you're seeing, there's what you're feeling, what you're hearing. Driving, a lot of it's going to be what you're seeing. So if you're seeing your cell phone screen and not the road, there's, your resources, your visual resources are being used on something that's not driving, and it leads to a decrease in your performance. We'll get through a little bit of visual Attention, so we talked about mostly auditory attention so far. So directing visual attention is your eyes, visual makes sense. So with your eyes, which you're visibly paying attention to, you're able to shift kind of between these things. Your eyes might be focused on something, but you're not paying attention to it. So that's the difference between overt shifts and covert shifts. An overt shift is accompanied by your eye movement, so you're paying attention to this thing that you're now looking at. A covert shift is you're paying attention to something that you're not looking at. You've switched between that, and eye movement is not necessary in that case. Very difficult to tell, obviously, in an experimental setting. If you're looking at something and you're not paying attention to it, it's like, great, what does that tell me? But when you're looking at a scene, when you're looking generally, your eyes move and they focus. So there's a difference between saccades and fixations. So a saccade is a rapid eye movement from one location to another. So I'm looking at that corner, I'm looking at that corner. It's very rapid, that shift between, that's the saccade. And then the fixation would be my actually looking at that point. So saccade from that point to bottom corner, whatever. And a fixation is that short pause when you're paying attention to that point of interest, the thing that's actually capturing your attention. So eye movements can be studied with something that we call an eye tracker, which is cool. It basically sees the black part of your eye and it maps it to a screen, and it kind of tells you where the participants' eyes are actually looking. So it's kind of fun. It requires a lot of hardware, basically. It's still kind of difficult for computers to do. That's why it's sort of fun research, because a lot of what you can get into tells you some pretty cool information, but it might not be obvious, or it's kind of nice that we're able to do that with our current level of technology, and this has not been around for that long. But something that it can be applied to pretty easily, pretty happily to these companies' benefit is this marketing research. So you have somebody in an eye tracker, or you have an eye tracker on them, and then you just put an image in front of them, and the eye tracker will let you know what they're looking at. So it can let you know what they're looking at, like they look for a while at certain points, and it can also tell you what they looked at first, second, where their eyes kind of drifted along the screen. So if you are trying to sell something, for instance, and you're presenting it on a website, you want to make sure that somebody's fixating on your product rather than the advertisement that's on the side of the screen or the title of the web page or something like that. So it's basically, how do we make images that capture people's attention so we know what they're paying attention to, they're focusing on. So what do we focus on in a scene? There are things that can influence us bottom up and things that can influence us top down. We spoke a little bit about that before, but saliency is this idea of bottom up capture. So how salient something is basically how likely is it to get your attention. So in the scene that we see on the left is a picture of apples. What are you most likely paying attention to? The red one, yeah, exactly. It stands out from the crowd. It's something else. So it's more likely to capture our attention. It's also high contrast, so it's the thing that has more color on the screen than the green that's happening around it. Orientation, also our minds, like we said, our neurons are sensitive to different orientation, essentially. And then we have this top-down modulation of what we're visually paying attention to. So you see this horse that's very hungry in a scene where maybe you have a lot of different things. If there's some food in that environment, since he's hungry, it's going to predispose the horse to look for the apple itself. So that's what's going to stand out, because it's involved in his internal state. It's involved in what he would like to be doing at that time. So it would depend on kind of your goals, so the demand of the task, your internal states, and just the way that the scene is set up, what you're more likely to look at. Here is a conceptualization of saliency in an image map. So you have in your environment the image sensations, the light that's bouncing off of it, that you are receiving that signal from, interpreting. So that input image is then decomposed into this idea of intensity. So can deal with kind of these top-down or bottom-up things. So the intensity of that signal, maybe how much light is reflecting off of it, how important it is to you, that kind of thing. The actual colors of the image, so how are we able to distinguish that on a physical basis, so the actual signal that's sent into our retina. And the orientation of that object. All of these are combined in a certain way to make up our saliency map, so what is really standing out to us. That changes the location that we're attending to, so just take a look at kind of like an infrared sort of setting. In the picture of the butterfly, we're paying attention to the butterfly and not the things around because it stands out in color. We see a little bit more with its outstretched wing because we see the outline of that more clearly than a lot of the other outlines. And in the idea of the person, we're paying attention to most noticeably the eyes, which is something that socially is a predisposition of humans to pay attention to the eyes because they convey a lot of information, and then just information about the outline of this woman. And that's where we will stop for today. So it is slide 49. So 10 more slides that'll be posted either today or tomorrow. I'll post this lecture. So remember to do your discussion, remember to finish the exam, and have a good day.